Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Finnish President Alexander Stubb is in Prague, continuing his two-day visit and participating alongside President Petr Pavel in the Europe as a Task conference held at Prague Castle, where leaders are focusing on defense policy, industrial resilience, and Europe's strategic direction. Now, the visit coincides with domestic demonstrations over Czech public media reforms and ongoing geopolitical divisions within Central Europe. Now, former head of unit for countering hybrid threats, Czech Defense Ministry Ján Michalčák is our guest and discuss it further. Welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here. Good morning.
So, President Stubb, this is someone very much aligned with NATO, also very much aligned with President Pavel. What do you make of his trip there in Prague? What is he going to be able to achieve there?
A great question, and as you said, Stubb is a close ally, and I would even say friend of President Pavel. And I'm not exactly sure where their friendship comes from, but I would venture a guess that it has to do certainly with President Pavel and his past and as the NATO military chief. And of course, given that status, President Pavel now enjoys a great respect in terms of his views on the security situation in Europe, and especially Russia's unlawful aggression against Ukraine. And as we know, Stubb is also one of the very few European leaders that seems to have the ear of President Donald Trump in the US, which is, of course, an important ally still in tackling Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So if I were to guess, I would, of course, say that the two are close allies. And this conference that you mentioned that is taking place in Prague is a good way for them to realign, so to speak, and that could then maybe enable them to pass some messages, information to Donald Trump, who, as we know, has been vacillating in whether or not to support Ukraine and whether or not to respect Putin's opinions more on the war. So any ally we can get to Prague to listen to Pavel, who has very sensible opinions on the war, of course, and on the security situation, is a good message, not only for the Czech Republic, but I think for the whole of the continent.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think what's important here to discuss as well is the current proposed reforms to Czech media. I mean, we've already seen that's created, let's say, tension from a lot of the population. Tell us a bit on what exactly is at stake here, why the public reaction to this, and where is this all heading?
Right. So very briefly, the current Czech government is composed of populist two right-wing extremist parties. We have the ANO party of the Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, and then we have the SPD of the Motorist Party. And very simply said, both of those parties are not exactly friendly toward civil liberties and toward things like tackling foreign information manipulation and interference, which means tackling the influence coming from Russia. And of course, public media, such as the Czech television and radio, have been instrumental in passing factually correct and balanced information, not only on the security situation in Europe, and that's why those parties don't really like the presence of public and independent media, exactly because they do convey information that those parties don't really like, because the parties are, very simply said, friendlier to Russia than they are to our democratic institutions. And that's why those parties, together with Andrej Babiš, who needs those two parties, even though he himself, I would say, is friendlier to the independent media than the rest of the government, that's why they now embarked on a mission to make them less independent. And the way they want to do it is by scrapping the fact that they are now paid directly by the citizens, and they want to make the media state paid, so directly paid from the state budget. Now, that's not the case today, and if the reform passes, which seems highly likely, simply because the government has the votes to make that happen, that also means that the media becomes much more dependent on the whim of the government, of course, because now all of a sudden the government can simply dictate what the budget of both the television and the radio will be, which is not the case today. Now the amounts are strictly dictated by how much each citizen pays. And from next year on, the government should be able to say every single year, okay, we're gonna, give you $1 billion, $2 billion less, unless, for example, you do something we like more in your news reporting, etc., etc. That's what the population fears, and that's why we've seen the protests that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think also you put an interesting point on it there. And how does this change? How does this discussion in your mind change now? I mean, we've had very close by a big election in Hungary, 16 years of Orbán. A lot of that was exactly about this, about controlling the media. How much of that has bearing now on what happens in the Czech Republic? Is this going to sway any directions? I mean, you said it could pass, but how does that weigh into all this?
Of course, the fact that Orbán has lost in Hungary means that we very likely will see one leader fewer willing to and intent on destroying independent media. It is likely, not sure, but likely that the new Hungarian Prime Minister will want to restore the independence of Hungarian media, at least partially, which means that Czechia now, maybe together with Slovakia, which is also attacked, the government of Fico has also attacked its own public service media quite a lot. So maybe what we'll see is a picture of Czechia and Slovakia being the two most vocal and most hostile countries in the EU in relation to their public service media. I'm very worried about where this might lead to, because consistently in both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the public service media, the television and the radio have been ranked consistently as the most trusted sources of information. People really rely on it, and especially the Czech television, Czech radio produce high quality reporting, which, for example, is key in instances of catastrophes, of any unrests, because so in those, Czech television is usually the #1 source to go to. I think over 80% of the population consistently say they trust them. And all of a sudden, if we end up in a situation in which those sources seem the same on the surface, but are now suddenly paid by the government and so controlled by the government, who can, install their own board of members, for example, board of trustees, that might have some unforeseen circumstances, because the population will still be watching. They will still treat it as the trustworthy source that they once were, but something will have changed under the surface, and that might not be so catastrophic as I make it sound, but it might also be very far-reaching, the consequences. We'll have to see.
Just really briefly, one more sentence quickly on terms of time. Interesting, I want to follow that. How much then is your expertise in hybrid threats? How much does this make, if these reforms go ahead, the Czech Republic more susceptible to disinformation hybrid threats?
Quite a lot, so I'm afraid.
All right, so we'll have to be watching that. We're not quite sure of how it works out, but of course with this conference, this will be discussed, and I'll be watching it closely as ever here on TVP World. Look, thanks so much for all those insights. Always a pleasure having you there. Ján Michalčák, former head of Unit of Countering Hybrid Threats, Czech Defense Ministry. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.